Thank you for your time today. I'm going to be talking about supply chain, security and cyber defence. In contrast to what we were just talking about, I'm going to be talking about the known supply chain. In many ways, BYD, things like Dropbox are a concept called the unknown supply chain because the corporation doesn't really know about them. So just to make that quick distinction. So, in terms of cyber defence, for those of you who can't see very well, there's an elephant sitting in the boardroom. There's a phrase in English, if you're not familiar with it, called the elephant in the room, the thing that everybody's not talking about. People commonly expect that cyber attacks are going to be obvious. In actual fact, most cyber attacks are never detected, which seems very strange. My team have done a lot of penetration testing work. We also do a lot of remediation work. So one of our clients will get hacked and we'll come in and help them get over it. And prior to that, when I was at McAfee, obviously McAfee has a penetration testing organisation, which I was one of the leaders of. And one of the things we found consistently there was people didn't know that they had been attacked. They didn't know that data had been lost. And we also focus a lot, and the media focuses a lot, on the money that was stolen or on the data that was lost. One of the other common types of cyber attack is actually data damage, data destruction. And that's another thing that's not talked about very much. One of the ways that you can attack your competitors, one of the ways that you can attack an organisation you don't like, is just by ruining their data and destroying their data. And those are one of the hardest types of attacks to detect, and also one of the hardest types of attacks to do anything about. So, what are these attacks? Preparatory attacks, this one here, they're usually part of an information gathering exercise. They can be quite innocuous. One of the classic ways of doing a preparation attack is by telephoning people at random in the organisation, or by sending random emails to the organisation and seeing how many emails you get replied to. One of the other classics is to give away USB sticks. And people go, great, for a USB stick, thanks very much. And then they go and plug it into the corporate devices, and those USB sticks are able to send back information to the people who gave away that nice free USB stick. They're most effective, obviously, if they're not detected. If you don't know that that information has left your organisation, it's very hard to do anything about it. And unfortunately, with a lot of cyber attacks, at the point that the attack happens, it's now become too late to do anything about the attack. There's a lot of expectation that you'll be able to use your firewalls, you'll be able to use your IPS and network access control at the point of the attack, and your people in your security operations centre will be able to help you to combat it. Unfortunately, because so many cyber attacks are information-based, at the time that the attack has happened, the attack is actually over. One of the other common things we see is that the reasons why we detect an attack are unexpected. It's in things like server usage, in things like data centres that are using up too much electricity, using up too much bandwidth. One of the other ways that we detect them is that their air conditioning is performing too heavily. So there's lots of different ways that these are attacked. It's not always the fact that you are under distributed denial of service attack and none of your internet services are working. It's usually much more subtle than that. Penetration attacks. These are after information of value. We're doing a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies at the moment. Their assets is their medical research. They don't actually make the drugs themselves anymore. They don't actually distribute the drugs themselves anymore. Really, the only thing they do now is research new drugs. And if you're able to gain this information from them, you've got their business. And these are and we focus a lot, and the media focuses a lot on a bunch of teenagers who've got into a Department of Defence, as happened this week, or someone steals $1 million or a few million from the European Carbon Trading Scheme, as happened a few years ago. They managed to get 63 million. But these assets, these information assets, I was talking to a pharmaceutical company. They made one drug. That one drug generates 9 billion per year. One drug. If you can get the plans for that drug before they have finished patenting it, and you can get it out of the market before them, they can't patent it. And even better, if you can manage to patent it yourself, you're even more advantaged by that. So this is the real world. This information of value is where the real money is. And then, of course, there's damage attacks, which includes denial of service, but there's also basic things. There's a concept called a crypto worm. You inject cryptography into someone you're attacking and encrypt all their data. It's all destroyed, and then you can ransom the key for that encryption so that they can get their data back. It's very tricky and nasty. So, we still think that our hackers look like this. It's a frustrated middle-class youth whose parents didn't love him enough but bought him a computer. And funnily enough, the guys who got caught hacking the US Department of Defense this week were exactly these people. However, the ones we're really worried about look more like this now. One of the big hardware manufacturers gave a classified briefing at NATO last year. A team of 20 spent 9 months hacking them. That's the sort of teams that we're dealing with. And these aren't just a few people. These are teams who have different roles within the hacking team. So there's the people who do the hacking, there's people who do the social engineering, and then they actually have their own information security department to protect them while they do all this hacking, because while they're hacking across the internet, they're actually vulnerable from being hacked themselves. Highly professional, highly organised. And strong links to organised crime, and in fact some of them are actually owned by organised crime. They work for various national organised crime organisations. The next group are these guys, government. We all know about this. There's been a lot of discussion about this over the last few months since our friend Mr. Snowden decided to make all these statements. These two are usually friends. Almost all organised crime hacking requires either the toleration or the active support of the government from which it takes place. And the last one is these guys, the hacktivists. The hacktivists have an image of being pretty cool, pretty hip, have a cause. The other thing we know about these hacktivists is that they're friends with those other two. Because again, these hacktivists usually require the support of a government so that they have a safe place from which to operate. They often have links to organised crime. Sometimes hacktivists do jobs for organised crime. They actually hire themselves out. It's how they pay for all their gear, and it's how they pay for themselves. And some of them are actually doing quite well, thanks very much. These are all the external threats, but these aren't the ones we should worry about the most. Disgruntled staff are still a source of more cyber attack and cyber damage than all of the external threats put together. But they're still not the most dangerous people out there. The most dangerous people out there are these ones. People who make mistakes. Fundamentally, most of the hacking activities that we see from organised crime, from government and from the hacktivists actually rely upon these people making mistakes. In the penetration testing work that I've done, if I ring 100 employees of a company, I can pretty much guarantee that one of those 100 will give me their username and password. And if you're relying upon the multi-factor authentication dongle that you've issued to your staff so that they've now got a time-based password, we can usually get them to give us the current number on their dongle. So, unfortunate staff, major source of cyber threat. Why does this all matter for supply chain? Fundamentally, supply chain represents a unique challenge. Supply chain defence has always been based around some concepts around how the supply chain will get attacked. So the classic supply chain attack that you see on movies from the 1970s is someone hijacks a truck, or they hijack a ship, or they hijack a plane. Cyber attack is much less risky. You can go and attack an electronic supply chain without all the risk of having to go and beat up a truck driver. There's a concept called conflict economics. It essentially means the difference in cost between defending something and attacking something. So in conventional warfare, the conflict economics ratio is 3 to 1. It is 3 times more expensive to attack something in conflict economics than it is to defend something in conventional warfare. Unfortunately, in cyber attack, it's about 100 to 1 in favour of the attackers. It is 100 times more expensive to defend against cyber attack than it is to conduct a cyber attack. So we've seen the economics change rapidly. And the other thing that we're seeing is that a cyber attack can include the supply chain of the organisation. So one of the fastest ways to close down your competitor is not to bother to attack your competitor, you just go and attack one of their critical suppliers. Take away their water supply, take away their electricity, take away their telecommunications, and you can close them down just as effectively. So even if they have world-leading cyber defence, even if they're thoroughly well organised, you take away one of their critical suppliers, you've actually managed to close them down anyway, no matter how good their IT defence was. And in order to defend against this, when we look at how well our organisation is defended, we also need to know how well our suppliers are defended, because unless they're also well defended, we're not going to have any electricity, or we're not going to have any water, or we're not going to have any diesel, or something else we really need to run our organisation. We also need to assume in cyber defence that sometimes the opposition are going to win. Sometimes people are going to get into our organisation. So there's a couple of things that we can do about that. If we assume they're going to get in, let's have layered defences. Let's keep the most important things most heavily defended and have the less important things less well defended. As we were just talking in the panel, a risk-based approach. We also need to ensure that we don't have critical points of failure. That if our diesel supply was impacted, there is a reservoir of diesel, that there are other places we can get diesel from. That if our water supply is impacted, do we have reservoirs of water, and are there other places that we can get water from? And funnily enough, there are entire countries that have critical weaknesses in this area. And the other thing is that if we know that a cyber attack is going to require a preparation stage, if we know they're going to have to gather information about us, let's have steps in place to detect that information gathering. There's some really interesting stuff being done in terms of detecting social engineering. There's some really interesting stuff being done in terms of detecting these early stages. And the vendors that are selling these solutions are doing some very innovative things in terms of both how do we detect them, but also how we prevent them. And funnily enough, one of the best ways that we prevent them is in education. And people are also looking at the automated measurement of education, funnily enough, which is a very interesting concept. One of the other things that we need to do in order to detect that we are being attacked, that we are being looked at by an external threat, is to know what our normal state is. And this is a concept that if we know what normal looks like in our organisation, if we know how much bandwidth we usually use on Sunday morning, or how much electricity we usually use on Friday night, and we find out that we're using more electricity on Friday night, that we're using more bandwidth on Sunday morning, that fundamentally there are more logins per hour than we would expect. If we look at the fact that we're getting more requests for patching than we would expect. These are one of the ways that we can detect abnormal activity, that we can detect that someone is looking at our organisation and that we may be looking at an imminent cyber attack. And it's this recognition of our normal operating state that allows us to do this. And there's a series of different ways that we can do this. There's the ones I've already talked about in terms of air conditioning, power, bandwidth, water. There's also having a view of what's taking place on our laptops and even our BYOD devices, because they are avenues into our organisation. So we need to think about what's taking place on them. Does our host intrusion prevention on our laptops actually indicate an increase in activity? Because that may be another indicator of an increase in activity elsewhere. One of the other indicators, interestingly enough, is an increase in the frequency of password resets, because an increase in the frequency of password resets is one of the indicators of social engineering. And so we can look at a series of different measures. We can look at a measure in a series of different things. One of the other things that we look at this diversity of measures is that we know that the hackers, when they are doing an intelligence analysis of an organisation, one of the things that they actually look at is how that they correct logs. They actually change firewall logs. And interestingly, what this means is that if we are relying only upon information security information, we may actually be looking at falsified information. One of their techniques is to change the information security information. So what we do then is we go and look at non-information security information. One of the other crucial issues that we have is privilege acquisition. What this means is that they'll get access at a very low level. They'll get access, they'll get someone at reception to give them their username and password. Or someone has written down their username and password and they manage to get a copy of it. And even at a very low level, once they've got into the network, they then use privilege acquisition techniques in order to acquire greater and greater privileges until they can do some significant damage to the organisation. The way that this can be defended against is by utilising things like fine-grained access control and by ensuring that privilege management is in place. And by doing these sort of techniques, we can actually stop privilege acquisition. So if we go back to that concept of layered defence, what we see there is we see the ability to say, well, look, they're going to get in, so let's make sure they can only get in a little bit, and let's make sure they can't do any sustained damage if they do manage to get in. One of the other things that we can do is that we can say, well, look, let's have layered defence. Let's not just say that we're going to have firewalls and IPSs on the external network. We might have a little bit of segmentation around the demilitarised zone, and then after that it's open season. Make sure there are barriers within the organisation. Make sure that there are multiple layers of security, and that the most important information in the organisation is in that most protected area. Have information that is based upon risk and commensurate with the risk that's being faced. One of the other interesting things we're looking at is virtualisation. Most people, when they talk about virtualisation, assume it creates greater risk. If you go and talk to some of the militaries, if you go and talk to some of the governments, they will say to you that there are some classes of information they will not put into virtual machines. And the reason is that they think they're fundamentally more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable to side channel attack. One of the interesting things, though, is that virtualisation, and it's one of the current areas being researched by us and others, virtualisation may actually provide opportunities to make attack of virtual environments more complicated, more confusing for the hackers. If we think about the fact that hackers actually have to go and gather information, and they have to know that the information that they're looking at is the information they need or the information that they want to destroy, there are ways that we can divert their attention, there are ways that we can confuse them, that we can do in a virtual world that we cannot do in a physical world. So there's some interesting research taking place there. What do we need to measure? Everyone has a different list. So the SANS Institute have a list of 20. The UK government and the Australian government each have a list of 10. This is the list that was come up with by the Telecommunications Management Forum. My apologies, for some reason the bullets haven't come out the same on this screen as on mine. But essentially what happened was that the Telecommunications Management Forum said, well, look, what would be the first 6? What would be the 6 things you'd look at first in terms of saying, I am defended, but I know that my supply chain is defended? Because if I can, as I said, if I can close down the supply chain of an organisation, I may not need to attack that organisation itself. So very quickly, time to apply patches, time unpatched. This is both a useful technical measure, and the reason it's a useful technical measure is obvious. Are the machines patched? But it's actually a very good leading indicator of how well organised the information security of that organisation is. Fundamentally, organisations that have a high rate of time to apply patches and a low rate of time unpatched are often the best managed. So it's the first one we look at. Completeness of patching across devices. So how many devices didn't get patched? Really, really relevant in the laptop world, funnily enough, and in that smartphone world. Because it's in that world that this can be the most difficult, because you have devices that aren't connected for long periods of time. Criticality of deviation from patching standards. Again, how many devices don't get patched properly. The audited degree of system susceptibility. This is a bit more complicated. It usually requires things like McAfee Vulnerability Management, or Qualys, but it's a qualitative measure of, okay, how well are they patching everything? How many vulnerabilities are left after patching, and how many patches are needed? One of the other interesting things we know is that some of the best run environments actually need the fewest number of patches. And when you get into the whole world of Linux, this becomes much more complicated. And funnily enough, this guide to patch management has just been endorsed by the UK Cabinet Office. So, what does this look like? A global telco actually listed 16 types of critical supplier. The UK Defence estimates that there's 4 levels of nesting. So what this means is that my suppliers. So to break that down, if I'm a telecommunications company, I need diesel for my battery backup. My diesel company needs water, because obviously they need water. And the water company needs electricity. So that's an example of my suppliers. 4 levels of nesting. If you take 16 critical suppliers, you have 4 levels of nesting. You need to find out that they have good supply for 4 levels back. You want to look at 6 metrics. You now have 393,000 different sets of data that are going to be flying around. This obviously isn't very efficient. And it's actually data that you don't want to be sending around to everybody. You don't actually want to tell everybody over the internet or by any other means, we're really behind on our patching right now and we're really vulnerable, so you should come and hack us. It's not the sort of thing you want to tell people. Obviously, you should be up to date on patching, but that would be better. So one of the things that we're looking at, and various governments are looking at, is this concept of cyber assurance hubs. It's a very similar concept to financial auditing. Most companies that are listed on most stock exchanges go and get an external auditor in, and the external comes in and says, well, yes, their accounts are pretty much as they describe them. And these days they get IT auditors in, and they say to the IT auditors, yes, they're reasonably well defended. So if there's going to be an automated means to get across the incredible 390,000 different data sets, one of the things that people are now looking at is having hubs. And all of the organisations within that supply chain network will send in their 6 metrics to the hub, and then the hub is able to tell everybody in that supply chain network that that company is well defended. So what would that look like? It shouldn't look like that. Anyway, I think we've got the wrong file, actually. Never mind. So what that would look like is basically all of these organisations would send in their data to the central hub. The central hub would produce a report, and that report would say, yes, they're defended, yes, they're healthy, and yes, you should feel assured that they're going to have the right type of supply. So how does this fit into a wider picture? We think that in an agile security world, that in a world where people have a level of defence, that people have a level of supply of assurance, our view is that this requires secure and protected identity. We need to know who is using our systems. That needs to be protected so that we're not vulnerable to things like privilege acquisition. We're not vulnerable to things like social engineering. We need to have a risk-based security approach. We need to understand what the value of our data is, what the needs of the people who are using that data is, and then how do we assess the risk. We need to have defence in depth, not just one layer of defence, so if they manage to get a username and password, they can have everything in the organisation. What we need to have is we need to have defence in depth and better security as we go through. One of our other key messages at the moment is enabling mobility. As we've said in the last session, we actually think there's a lot of advantages to be had in mobility. I think the gentleman at the second table, there's a question about does it actually lead to more productivity or not. It's a fascinating one. The only studies I've seen on that question are actually from telecommunications companies, so you might say they're a bit biased. And then we need to be able to leverage cloud services securely. And this is a critical one, particularly when we talk about supply chain. Interestingly, one of the biggest supply chain networks that makes the largest use of cloud services is actually the consortium that made the Eurofighter. Now, it sounds really surprising. A very, very risk-averse organisation with heavy national security implications made large use of cloud facilities in the development of that. And the reason is that they have lots of really clever cryptographers who did lots of really clever cryptography around the cloud services, and they were able to convince themselves that they had a standard of security on those cloud services comparable or better to having done that development, that joint development, with more than 100 different companies if they hadn't used cloud services. It's a really interesting use case. And of course, we want to lower the cost of ownership. Why do we want to lower the cost of ownership? Because the evidence, certainly in Europe and North America, and to a lesser extent, but increasing throughout the rest of our region, and in particular this region, is that we need to be able to do all this with less money, unfortunately. The last thing I wanted to show you was this. I really like this picture. For those of you who aren't aware, this is Dover Castle in England. It's, most of this was built 860 years ago. So it's really interesting because it's so old. From a supply chain point of view, it's also really interesting because it was built to defend the UK's most critical military and supply port to France. Basically, this is the closest point to France for the UK, and it's where a lot of the people came through. It's also where all the soldiers who kept invading France from England left from. What's interesting about this is that there are some buildings here that you can't see in the photo that were considered to be non-critical, castle functions that weren't important, so they stuck them outside the walls. Then you see the first wall. It's got a big ditch in front of it, but this wall is the smallest wall. And inside the smallest wall, they stuck the next group of things that were the next least important. Interestingly, the church is one of them. And that was where the things that, okay, they're a little bit important, but they're not very important. Then you get the next and biggest wall. And that wall is where they stuck the next group of things that were most important to them behind. And then finally, there's the keep. And that's where they put the most important things. That's where they put the jewels. That's where they put their wives. That's where they put the things that they most wanted to protect. What's interesting about this is that 860 years ago, they understood, first of all, that supply chains are really important. So they built one of the biggest castles in the whole country on their most critical supply point. 2, they understood defence in depth. And 3, they've used a layered defence and a risk-based approach so that the value of what they were trying to protect is commensurate with how much protection it gets.